Okay, so we're going to be continuing with volume F from now on, right? So after today, that's the only one you're going to need to bring to class. So we're also going to be continuing with Irish literature next time. So we're going to be reading James Joyce's short story, The Dead. Now, I sent out yesterday the assignment sheet for paper 2. Did everybody get a chance to look at it? Okay, so does anybody have any questions about it? Is there anything anybody wants to go over or discuss? Yes, Randy.
So, you know the paper that we did in our midterm exam?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Does those topics count against what we can't use?
Well, think about it this way. It's been a while, and I'm really busy, so I don't really remember what you guys used in your midterm answers.
I was so happy when I did my quiz, like the answers were still there. I was like, yes!
Yeah, it looked like something had just happened where it hadn't submitted properly or something. Because like I was getting, like it was showing me the icon that said that you had a quiz there, but it wouldn't let me access it for some reason. So yeah, that's all fixed now. So everything's good. Okay, does anybody have any other questions about paper 2? So because this is a research paper, right, I am happy to help all of you try to find sources if you're having trouble, right? So if you are having difficulties with the library resources, please just ask me. However, one thing that I do not want to hear from anyone is I can't find any sources. Now, why might that be?
Because you gave me.
Because I've been giving you a bibliography every day since the beginning of the semester, right? So that's partly for transparency on my part, right? You know, I want to show you guys that this is what I consulted in putting the lecture together, right? So, you know, I'm not just pulling all this out of my ass. But also, you know, it's to give you a starting point for your own research papers, right? So, you know, this way you've got some sources already that you know you can find either in Galileo already or by requesting them from Tapasso, right? And the bibliography gives you all the information you need to request it from Tapasso if that's what you have to do. All right.
How many sources do you have to use?
Pardon?
How many sources?
5 secondary sources. Yeah. You can use journal articles or scholarly books. Or chapters from scholarly books.
And the text we're analyzing doesn't count as sources, right?
That does not count towards your 5. No, it's 5 secondary sources plus your 2 primary sources, right? Everybody understands the distinction between secondary and primary sources, right? The primary source is the thing you're studying. The secondary sources are the things you're using to illuminate it, right? Okay. Good. Any other questions? Just give you a minute to consider. The grading rubric also is on the back, just so you know exactly as well what I will be most concerned with in assigning you a grade. Okay, so why don't we get started with today's discussion then, and if people have questions about this later, you can always feel free to get in touch with me. All right, so what, if anything, do you guys know about Ireland?
Like a really bad drought.
Yeah, this is actually, we've already touched on events happening in Ireland in our discussions of English literature, right? Yeah, in the 1840s there was that potato famine, right, that contributed to the Depression throughout much of Western Europe and North America in the 1840s, right? So yeah, for several years in the 1840s, the potato crop, for several years in a row, the potato crop failed. And this period is known in Irish history as the Great Hunger, or in Irish, An Gortamór. Now, anything else is there anything else you guys know about Ireland? Just so I know kind of like what kind of baseline to start from here. We actually have touched on events in Ireland quite a bit, but kind of obliquely. Does anybody know what relationship Ireland had with England and with the British government in the 19th century?
It was struggling.
Okay, yeah. There was a good deal of anti-colonial struggle happening in Ireland, right? Because Ireland was was a British colony, right? It had been politically dominated by Britain since the Middle Ages, and then in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Tudors and then their Stuart successors consolidated British control of most of Ireland, right? So historically, there was no such unified nation as Ireland, right? What we've got, and again, forgive the general shittiness of my artwork, but Ireland looks sort of like this, right? It's a vaguely potato-shaped island about the size of New Jersey. And it was traditionally divided into 4 kingdoms. Right, you had Ulster in the north, Munster in the south, Leinster in the east, and Connaught in the west. This is a slight oversimplification, but this will do for our purposes. And these kingdoms all shared a cultural and religious identity. They spoke the same language, but they warred with each other as often as they allied with one another, right? Dublin, the largest city in Ireland, is about here. So, for the most part, ethnically, the Irish were what are called Celts. So they're related to the Scots and to the Welsh, but there are also a number of what were called Old English living in Ireland. That is, people whose ancestors came over in the Middle Ages. And a good number of Norse, especially down around Dublin and slightly south of there, right? Now, people with this line of descent were predominantly Roman Catholic. Now, in the 16th century, after a series of revolts by Catholic noblemen, you had a series of what were called plantations, especially in Ulster and in Munster. Though only the Ulster plantation really took hold. So, disloyal Catholic noblemen were dispossessed from their lands and replaced by loyal Protestants from England and from Scotland. though south of Ulster, the majority of the island remained Roman Catholic, and does to this day, right? This division continues into the present, where Ulster has a slight Protestant majority, and the rest of Ireland has an overwhelming Catholic majority. So, where things really come to a head here is in 1688. Now, I'm going to take us back to the very beginning of the semester when we talked about revolutions and the original meaning of the term revolution. Does anybody remember, and it's cool if you don't, this was a while ago, what the Glorious Revolution was?
It was Henry not the 8th. It was the king in England was replaced by the king in England was a Catholic, and then he was replaced by a Protestant.
Yes, it's James II you're thinking of, yes.
Did I just say revolution that means out with the old and in with the new?
That's what it tends to mean now, right? Do we remember what it meant before, at the time of the Glorious Revolution?
A change.
Return back.
Yeah, it was not about return, like out with the old, in with the new. It was about turning back, right? Returning to a point of origin. So yeah, James II is overthrown by his daughter Mary and her husband, a Protestant Dutch nobleman named William III, who lives on in Irish myth and iconography as King Billy. Right now, King Billy is a hero to Irish Protestants, and a historical villain to Irish Catholics, right? So both communities, both religious communities, read this figure very differently. So by 1690, William's forces have so I'm getting ahead of myself here. In 1688, when he is overthrown, James and his supporters flee to Ireland, where they hope they can rally Irish Catholics to his cause, right? And they do, and they make an alliance with the French that doesn't really pan out. And they're defeated anyway. And in 1690, James and his descendants agree to live in exile in Europe. And William and Mary institute a series of what are called the penal laws that limit the rights of Catholics, both in terms of their religious expression and in terms of their ability to own property, right? Now, the ostensible reason for these laws were to prevent large public gatherings of Catholics where they might get riled up, and also to prevent them from having enough money or property to buy weapons, right? Catholics were also not allowed to own horses under the penal laws. So, for most of the 18th century, Ireland is culturally and politically dominated by relatively wealthy Protestants. And these relatively wealthy Protestants are referred to as the ascendancy. And they're not really an aristocracy. They're more of a bourgeoisie, right? Several of them are landowners, although a lot of the landowners are absentees, right? They live mostly in England and, let someone else manage their Irish estates. Others are members of the professional classes, lawyers, doctors, things of that nature. Sometimes both, right? Sometimes they're landlords and professionals. But this ascendancy class are also known as the Anglo-Irish. become really culturally important in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the class from which W.B. Yeats ultimately descends. So, in 1798, a group called the United Irishmen stages a rising. And this, like, in Ireland, the term that, like, the term that they use for what we would call a revolution is rising. So the United Irishmen are a pan-Irish group, right? They come from all over the island. And they also encompass all Irish socioeconomic and religious identities. The leaders are mostly educated upper-class Protestants, but a number of Catholic peasants and ordinary city people get involved as well. So this rising is most violently and swiftly put down, but it looms large to this day in the Irish imagination, right? Just as King Billy is made a historical villain in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution and the penal laws, right? The leaders of the United Irishmen are still often kind of celebrated in Irish poetry and song. So people like Wolfe Tone and Henry Joy McCracken. Often, have, bars named after them. There are streets named after them in various Irish cities, monuments to them, right? And they're frequently mentioned in poetry and in folk songs. So despite the fact that this rising is a failure, it still becomes kind of like a kind of baseline in the Irish imagination, right? So throughout the 19th century, groups like the Fenians and the Ribbonmen, most of it, like the Ribbonmen are agrarian radicals, so they're mostly out in the country. The Fenians tend to be a little bit more urban and come mostly from the Catholic lower middle classes. They stage a series of failed risings over the course of the 19th century, right? And things particularly heat up for the Fenians in particular after the famine of the 1840s, because do we remember why this famine was such a big deal in British and Irish relations? Do we remember what the British government did about this famine?
They did nothing.
Pretty much nothing, yeah. They decided to let the market take care of it. And in fact, they were actively exporting Irish grain into England at the time the famine was going on, right? So this strikes a lot of Irish people as a particularly egregious abuse of relationship in which they have little power because they don't have enough representation in Parliament to do anything about it, right? So this starts a kind of two-pronged movement, right? On the one hand, there's the tradition of what comes to be called physical force nationalism, with which groups like the Fenians are associated, right? accomplish independence through violence. And the goal of physical force nationalism, which is associated with but not identical to what comes to be called Irish republicanism, right, has nothing to do with the American Republican Party, right? Completely different animal here. The goal of Irish republicanism is a 42-county Irish independent republic. So the whole of Ireland united in a single republic, right? There was a milder tradition that pushed for what they called home rule. So what the home rulers were arguing for was an independent parliament for Ireland that was still subservient to and subsidiary to the Westminster Parliament in London, but that would make decisions about local issues in Ireland, right? So what they were asking for was a form of kind of limited independence to be achieved through political means. Now, Yeats exemplifies a third prong of Irish nationalist strategy, what's called cultural nationalism. And before we get into what that means, it's probably a good idea if we take a few minutes to talk about how Victorian Britain typically depicted the Irish in media, right? What the English perception of Irish people was. And we'll get into some of that as we look at the Matthew Arnold piece. But I want to look, yeah, go ahead, Serena, you have a question? But I want to look first at how the Irish were depicted in the popular press, right? So we've got a couple of examples here. So just take a minute, look at this picture, and tell me what you notice. What's going on here?
That's supposed to be a leprechaun.
What makes you think it looks like a leprechaun?
The high cheekbones.
Okay, high cheekbones, the hat, right? He's gritting his teeth, his clothes are shabby, right? What's he doing here? What's happening?
He's sitting on gunpowder.
He's sitting on a barrel of gunpowder, right? He's holding a torch. He's already lit the fuse, right? And he's surrounded by his wife and children. So, the implication, right? We see he's got a gun tucked into his belt here too, right? The implication here being that the Fenians will blow themselves and all their loved ones up just to spite the British, right? So sit on that for a minute, compare this to some of the others we're going to look at. The Nation was an Irish nationalist newspaper. And here we have Mr. G. O'Rilla of the Young Ireland Party exulting over the insult to the British flag. Shouldn't he be extinguished at once? We've got jars of pickled cabbage and vitriol up on the shelf here. All these bills that are labeled treason, right? And yeah, what we've got here is an ape in a coat dipping a quill in ink, right? Now what's going on here? So these two figures in the back are John Bull, who represents, he's like this kind of allegorical figure for England, right? And Uncle Sam, who is the same to the United States. And what's going on with the Irishman here? What do we notice about him?
Kind of looks like the gorilla from the last picture.
Yeah, his features are ape-like, right? He's fat, he's got a knife, and he's dancing on top of all of these goods, right? Destroying, like, the implication here again being that he'll destroy these things rather than let them get to England or America, right? If I can't have them, you can't either. What do we notice is consistent in the way the Irish are portrayed in these pictures?
Not humans. They're like several human characteristics.
Uh-huh.
Kind of like sophisticated and barbaric.
Okay, yeah. Barbaric. Non-human, right? They kind of look like human-ape hybrids, right?
Selfish.
Selfish. Poor, right? And in most of these pictures, also violent, right? So all of this has its origins in Victorian anthropology. So in the early days of the science of anthropology, much of what was done by scholars is a kind of classification of people according to racial types. So you would see things in anthropology books that looked like this. You would often see a series of human faces of different racial categories across from pictures of different species of ape, right? And we notice as we move from the European faces up here, the Asian faces here, to the African and Middle Eastern faces on the lower two rungs, right? That as you go down, the features get more ape-like, right? Now, a lot of what this was intended to do was demonstrate the superiority of Europeans overall as a racial type, and in particular of Anglo-Saxon and Teutonic Europeans, right? So Northern Europeans over everybody else. Right? The Nazis actually drove a lot of their inspiration from Victorian anthropology. Now, why does it matter, or what does it tell us, that in these cartoons, then, the Irish are given these ape-like features?
If you said that the Europeans are supposed to be like superior, that would mean that the Irish are like inferior.
Yeah. If they are a European type, they're being depicted as an inferior European type, right? More closely related to these other racial groups that European anthropologists are putting kind of on the bottom rungs of the evolutionary ladder, right? And a lot of this is a kind of misapplication of Darwin's theory of evolution, right? The idea being that more primitive people are thus more ape-like somehow. Also making a lot of assumptions about cultures, right? That, a culture that is not advanced along the same lines as my own must be primitive, right? So, what the hell was that?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that Yeats and others are trying to do is demonstrate that Ireland, in fact, has distinct cultural and artistic traditions that are of value and that are separate from English and other European traditions, right? So cultural nationalism is a kind of demonstration of, how do I want to put this?
Cultural superiority?
Not so much superiority, but it's a demonstration certainly of cultural difference and opposition to difference from and opposition to the colonizing culture. Now, Yeats's position relative to Ireland is a little bit complicated in this way, right? Because what group is he descended from? Is he of Celtic Irish Catholic descent? He is not. He comes from these ascendancy people, right? These Anglo-Irish who dominated Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries. So, while a lot of other cultural nationalists were in favor of returning to the use of the Irish language, in fact, there were organizations like the Gaelic League that encouraged people to start using to use the Irish language publicly rather than English. There are organizations like the Gaelic Athletic Association that were devoted to the revival of specifically Irish sports like hurling, which is, I don't know, do you guys know what hurling is? It's similar to lacrosse. It's a kind of hockey-like game where you have a stick that has a curved end, and you try to catch the ball in the stick and throw it into a net. And in some cases, they just invented sports, like Gaelic football, which is pretty similar to rugby, but is most decidedly not rugby because it's Gaelic football, right? So, for Yeats, the idea of going back to the recent Irish past, or to the Irish language as sources of inspiration, is problematic because that doesn't include people like him, right? So Yeats's idea of cultural nationalism embraces the English language, but focuses primarily on Irish content. So, religious difference is also a problem here, right? So, the thing that Yeats goes back to for this content is not 19th century Irish contemporary folk life, but mythology and folklore. Essentially what he's doing is looking for a kind of shared past in pre-Christian Ireland. To get around the Protestant Catholic religious divide. So, I want to look for a moment at the Matthew Arnold piece, just so we get some sense of what kinds of ideas Yeats is reacting against. We go to page 693. So, Arnold is expressing typical British ideas about Celtic peoples, the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots, right? And as in material civilization he has been ineffectual, so has the Celt been ineffectual in politics. This colossal, impetuous, adventurous wanderer, the Titan of the early world, who in primitive times fills so large a place on earth's scene, dwindles and dwindles as history goes on, and at last has shrunk to what we now see him. For ages and ages the world has been constantly slipping ever more and more out of the Celts' grasp. They went forth to the war, Ossian says most truly, but they always fell. So, if we boil this paragraph down, what is Arnold saying about the Celts historically? What are they?
A shell of their former self. They're not really. They don't have their culture that they had back then.
But they've also kind of always been losers, right?
They're ineffective.
Yeah, he keeps using the word ineffectual, right? They're materially ineffectual. They can't make money, right? They're politically ineffectual. They can't enforce their will on anyone else, right? And they're also apparently militarily ineffectual because they go forth to the battle, but they always fell, right? So, if we come into this next long paragraph, then we see kind of where Arnold is willing to give the Celts some credit, right? And yet, if one sets about constituting an ideal genius, what a great deal of the Celt does one find oneself drawn to put into it. Of an ideal genius, one does not want the elements, any of them, to be in a state of weakness. On the contrary, one wants all of them to be in the highest state of power, but with a law of measure, of harmony presiding over the whole. So the sensibility of the Celts, if everything else were not sacrificed to it, is a beautiful and admirable force. For sensibility, the power of quick and strong perception and emotion, is one of the very prime constituents of genius, perhaps its most positive constituent. It is to the soul what good senses are to the body, the grand natural condition of successful activity. Sensibility gives genius its materials. One cannot have too much of it, if one can but keep its master and not be its slave. Do not let us wish that the Celt had had less sensibility, but that he had been more master of it. So, this idea that this quality that he attributes to the Celts, sensibility, we're familiar with this, right? Do we remember what sensibility was?
Wasn't it like taking everyday objects and making it unknown to evoke?
You're thinking along the right lines. That's defamiliarization. But sensibility is related to that, right? Anybody remember sensibility? That's sympathy, but sympathy comes from sensibility, right? So yeah, we're digging in the right trench here, right? Sensibility is one's susceptibility to sensory and emotional impressions. So the thing that Arnold is suggesting here, right, is that Celts have superior sensibility, right? They are extremely susceptible to sense impressions and to emotional impressions, but that they have little control over it, right? And that this is why they are historical failures. Because they can't get a handle on their sensibility. Right? If only they could be more practical and control it, right? And I think what Yeats, in his poetry, tends to do is both embrace and complicate this idea of sensibility. So what I'd like us to turn to is The Stolen Child, the first Yeats poem that I asked you to read for today. on page 212. Now, the first thing I want to note about this before we start digging into it more specifically is that Yeats locates this poem in a very specific Irish place. So Yeats himself spends most of his adult life going back and forth between Dublin and London. But he spends much of his time as a child in Sligo, in the west of Ireland, right, in the old kingdom of Connaught. And Yeats and other revival writers tend to regard the west of Ireland as the real Ireland, for a couple of reasons. The west was still largely Irish-speaking at the end of the 19th century and was also predominantly rural. And folklore and folkways were retained there that had largely been lost or abandoned in the east of Ireland, in the more urbanized part of the country. So the place that was regarded as the most Irish part of Ireland by a lot of these revival writers and thinkers was a small cluster of islands off the western coast of Ireland called the Aran Islands. Where people maintained a kind of traditional fishing and sheep herding lifestyle. And relatively few islanders spoke much English, right? They predominantly spoke Irish. So Yeats is one of those who is responsible for centering the Irish imagination in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the West. Right. A lot of his image of the West is a fiction. You know, we'll say that right off the bat. But this is how people like Yeats are perceiving the west of Ireland. So can I get a volunteer to start reading for us on Where Dips the Rocky Highland of Sleuthwood in the Lake?
Where dips the rocky
Thank you,
highland
Nick.
of Sleuthwood in the lake. There lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake. The drowsy water rats, there we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters in the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand.
So what's happening here in this poem? What's the primary action? Who's speaking in the poem?
The fairies?
Yeah, okay, the fairies are the speakers, right?
Yes, I thought they're trying to like kidnap a child, like to take it away from the world that it's living in.
Exactly, yeah. The fairies are trying to lure a child to come with them, right? Does anybody know what this motif in folklore is called? Anybody ever heard the term changeling before? So the changeling story, a lot of folklorists now believe was a kind of pre-scientific rationalization that parents made to explain things like early infant death or severe disability in children, right? This idea that, my child was born healthy and normal, but the fairies took it away and replaced it with, a block of wood they placed an illusion on, or with a fairy child that can't survive in this world, or something like that, right? The idea being that the fairies stole children, human children, to essentially to strengthen their own bloodlines, right? So that's what's going on here in the poem. That's the main action of the poem.
Do you know, I can kind of relate this because I had a music appreciation class.
Uh-huh.
And I can't remember the name of the piece, but it was like a child was sick and his father was on a horse.
Uh-huh.
Trying to take him to the doctor.
And the elf king keeps pinching him?
Yeah.
Yes, Erlkönig. That's what it's called. Yes, the poem is by Johann Wilhelm von Goethe, and the musical setting is by Franz Schubert. Yes.
So that's related to that.
Yeah, it's the same theme. Yeah, it recurs across, like even not just European cultures, like across human cultures. Right? There are often, I know that the Igbo people of Nigeria have a similar story about children they call I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but abanje, children who are born and then die early. They're essentially evil spirits who keep coming back to torment the parent, right? This is a really common folklore motif across human cultures. So let's see if we can kind of figure out what Yeats is doing with this. If you guys somebody continue reading from Where the Wave of Moonlight Glosses.
Where the wave of moonlight glosses, the dim gray sands of light. Far off by furthest rosses, we footed all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances. To the moon has taken flight, to and fro we leap, and chase the frothy bubbles, while the world is full of troubles, and is anxious in its sleep. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with the fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand.
So, what kind of world are the fairies painting? Like, what does it sound like life is like with the fairies? What kinds of things do they do? What are they promising the child that the child comes away with them in these first two stanzas?
They'll be away from the troubles of this world.
Okay, yeah, the world's more full of weeping than you can understand, which also suggests the child doesn't really understand what they're leaving behind, right? What else? What sorts of things happen in the fairy world?
Chase bubbles.
Yeah, they dance around chasing bubbles, right? They dance all night. They have these vats full of cherries, right? So, what does this sound like? I mean, does this sound like a pretty good deal?
For a child.
Yeah. It sounds almost like a kind of eternal childhood, right? Nothing but fun and diversion.
Yeah, so they lower you to your death.
Well, there's no suggestion here that the fairies intend to kill the child, right? What do you think there is? What about this sounds ominous to you?
I don't know. It's just like based on my knowledge of like fairies, it like differentiates between cultures. But a lot of people believe that fairies like lie and trick you to like once you take something from their world, that's how they like trap you, and then like you're there forever. Yeah,
their value sets are not human values, right? So yeah, in most folklore traditions, fairies don't follow the same kinds of moral or ethical codes that humans do. They often do have some kind of code, but it's alien, right? And indeed, we already see here the fairies engaging in antisocial behaviors. Where do they get the cherries?
They stole them.
They stole them, yeah. We see in the next stanza, right? We seek for slumbering trout and whispering in their ears, give them unquiet dreams, right? So they're giving the fish nightmares. So there is a kind of hint here of at least a little bit of malice in these fairies, right? That they're maybe they're not quite so nice as they're making themselves out to be. And then can I get somebody to read the last stanza for us? Away with us he's going, the solemn-eyed.
And with us he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle of the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For he comes, the human child, to the waters in the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, from a world more full of weeping than he can understand.
Okay, so we can see the way the refrain changes, right? That the child is convinced, right, and is coming with them. But what do we note here about the life that's being left behind? What is the child losing by going with the fairies?
It's like home and family.
Yeah, I mean, this all kind of sounds like comfortable, right? He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or to see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. Yeah, like the things that he's leaving behind are these kinds of rural domestic comforts, right? And I think it's particularly important that Yeats uses the word peace here, right? He'll no longer hear the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast. Because if we look at the activities that the fairies describe, does it seem like they ever stop moving? Yeah, this fairy life seems to be one of constant motion and constant activity, right? They're always dancing, they're jumping up and down on bubbles, they're stealing cherries, they're being dicks to trout, right? But they don't stop and rest. And so the life that the child is going to with the fairies, I think, is a kind of life without peace and a life without rest, right? It might be fun much of the time, but it's not comfortable. And I think a lot of what's going on here, I think a lot of what Yeats is doing, like sort of in addition to trying to adapt an Irish folklore motif into an English language poem, I think a lot of what he's doing is talking about the relationship between the poet or the artist and mundane life, right? This is a fairly common theme, especially in Yeats's early poetry, right? Where the life of the artist and the life of the mind is often depicted in terms of this vibrant mythological world that not everyone seems to be able to access, but those few special people who are able to access it don't really get any peace from it, right? It doesn't bring them any comfort. So this child is arguably a figure for the artist, right? Being lured out of this, kind of everyday world of normal perception into this place of, fun and activity and magic. But, eventually the magic's going to wear thin, right? The magic isn't going to be as exciting as it was. I think the notion of the child's limited understanding is also important here, right? That the child does not understand what it loses by going to the fairy world. It does not properly appreciate these particular comforts. So Yeats is not the only writer in this period who's working in this particular idiom, right? So Yeats is probably the best known of the early Irish revival writers, most of whom are like him, Anglo-Irish ascendancy Protestants. But his close associates include the playwrights Lady Gregory and J.M. Synge, as well as the painter and poet George Russell, who went by the pen name A.E. There's also the fiction writer George Moore and the folklore scholar Douglas Hyde. The poet, Catherine Tynan. So one thing that I do want to note about this movement is that women are given a seat at the table here, right? And in fact are often some of the important prime movers. Lady Gregory in particular is important not just as a writer herself, but also as a patron of other writers, right? Most of these other revival authors benefited from Lady Gregory's patronage and stayed at her estate at various times in Galway. And all of these writers are working with the same basic complex of ideas, right? Irish peasant life, and mythology and folklore. And they're all doing so in the English language. Right. With the occasional exception of Douglas Hyde, who is still actually best known for translating Irish folk songs into English, but who also wrote some plays in Irish. In fact, of these writers, Hyde, Gregory, and Synge all understood Irish at the very least, right? They've done scholarly work in the Irish language, even though it wasn't the native language for any of them. So we're going to see, when we look at Joyce, an Irish writer of the next generation who is picking up and reacting to a lot of these tropes from this earlier generation of Irish writers, right? Now, Joyce, unlike most of these others, is a middle-class Catholic. So he's kind of coming from that Catholic petty bourgeoisie who make up much of the urban population of cities like Dublin. And his imagination is very much centered on Dublin and not on the west of Ireland. So we're going to see some of that tension between east and west of Ireland in The Dead, which is, I'm just going to say this, as far as I'm concerned, The Dead is the best short story ever written in the English language. You may or may not agree, but I love the hell out of this story. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about anything? So welcome to Ireland. We're going to stick with it for the rest of the week. And let me give you the reading questions for Joyce.